Hey, what's up, YouTube, and welcome back to Morgellons discussion and microscopy videos. I'm your host, Jeremy Murphy, and today I want to talk about why I talk about syphilis when I talk about Morgellons disease, why there's a pushback against that idea, and what kind of evidence is available to support the hypothesis, as well as what kind of evidence is available that discourages that potential. But first, I want to go ahead and give a shout out to everybody who's still making time to comment on these posts. And when I go back and comment them after time, thank you for being understanding that it took a little bit of time to get back to you. We try to get back to everybody eventually. So, getting right into it, the question is there any possibility that Morgellons is associated with syphilis? So, what we want to do is take a look at what the research says. And the research says that it is possible that Morgellons occurs in light of syphilis in a different group of patients that have been studied for the research that establishes Morgellons is a real skin condition. And so we're going to elaborate on a couple of issues also. Is Morgellons anything more than a skin condition? Do the fibers occur in people's organs? To the best of my knowledge, that has never been demonstrated scientifically. It has been mentioned anecdotally. However, there is no scientific evidence that has been published that I am aware of that demonstrates Morgellons fibers occur anywhere other than inside the skin. I do want to mention a recent study, and I'm going to include the link in the description below, about a lady who passed away. I believe she was 56 years old, and upon autopsy, they discovered Borrelia bacteria in every organ in her body and her brain. After she had been on years and years of oral and IV antibiotics. She was thought to have been cleared of the infection, but of course, as we know, Lyme disease often persists beyond treatment. And she had a recurrence or a reinfection. You know, that's something that people don't clearly understand about Lyme disease and syphilis compared with other infections. Sometimes you can get an infection like the chicken pox, and you're only going to get it once in your life, and then you've got those antibodies. That's why we have vaccinations, because a lot of infections, probably most of them, you can get infected with one time, and then your body learns how to defend itself against that infection in the future. Or we can teach it with vaccinations. Spirochetal infections are different. Syphilis, most recently in the news, was demonstrated to be able to evade the immune response by shifting a single gene. That bacteria can go inside your body, and the immune system can try to find it, but that bacteria has radar jamming capabilities inside its little cell. So the body can't ever really see it to do anything about it. And because of that radar jamming capability, you're able to get reinfected not only with the same strain of syphilis, but varying strains of syphilis. And here's the thing. You can get infected with syphilis and Lyme disease and even the tick-borne relapsing fever all at the same time. And you may fail every single test for each of those infections. Here's why. I just told you. The bacteria knows how to shift a gene on itself so that the immune system can't see it. If it can't see it, how can it produce antibodies for it? And that's why the tests fail, because those tests are looking for those antibodies specifically. We also have evidence that the later in the infection, the less likely it is to produce a positive on a test. We've also discovered that in the early stages of the infection, it may not be as likely to pick up on a test. Which begs the question, do we have to wait till the second stage of the infection to get a positive test? All right, so here's a couple of things that makes me think that yes, Morgellons could be associated with syphilis, besides what it says in the research. This is just based on my own studies, because when you have Morgellons, one of the things that a lot of people don't talk about, but you are afraid of, is that you have syphilis. You may not know what it's called. You just know that you have a skin condition and you're afraid of giving it to somebody else. And people are afraid of catching it from you. So you may go over to their house to work out on their weight bench, and after you're done, they may get a sterilizing rag and wipe it completely down. It may hurt your feelings, but you got to understand, you don't want to hurt their body by giving them this funk. A lot of patients even wrap themselves up in bags, and they wear gloves all the time because they're afraid of infecting their families. But even syphilis has been demonstrated to not be communicable in the late stage. Okay, that's why you can have physical contact with these people and you don't catch their sores. It's hard in the late stage. I don't know why. I will have to study about that more to find out for sure. But it's not as infectious in the late stage. In the early stage and the secondary stage is when it's reportedly the most infectious. And I'll leave links in the description below about all this. So why I think that Morgellons could be associated with syphilis, besides what the research says, a big reason is because of the tests not being accurate. Not just because of the lack of antibody production, but also because of the cross-reactivity between other spirochetal bacteria. There is one study that I read which really tipped me off about this and made me look at this more seriously. And I've had email correspondence with some of the scientists working on this about this information. And we have a disagreement about this particular issue. On the one hand, the evidence looking for syphilis in these patients using PCR method didn't find them. Now you could say, okay, that's because they don't have it. Or the other possibility is that the research demonstrates PCR sensitivity falls off the later the infection is allowed to progress. So that in the late stage, it's more possible to have a false negative PCR than in an earlier stages of the infection. It's also demonstrated in the research that where the tissue sample was selected from may increase or decrease the potential of having an accurate PCR test for syphilis, because that infection may be inhabiting those particular cells from that tissue sample, or it may have never even touched it ever. And if it can evade the immune response, then there's not going to be any kind of antibodies around there, potentially. The cross-reactivity found that the standard Lyme disease test, the ELISA, gives a false positive in light of a syphilis infection. There's one study I saw where the Palmer Eye Institute found one case. It was one individual who had progressive debilitations. He had a positive Lyme test. They went back with more extensive testing, and eventually they did determine that this man had neurosyphilis. It had progressed into his brain. They went back and tested their entire patient population and found another 6 cases of individuals who had a positive Lyme disease ELISA, but when they went back to test them with further extensive testing, they found positive evidence of syphilis. That really freaked me out. When I saw that, I was like, oh crap, this could be syphilis, or both. Now, some people will say that Lyme disease is a lot more dangerous than syphilis, and that's just not true. They'll say that Lyme disease has more capabilities than syphilis, and that's not true either. And I'll give you some specific examples. Yeah, I'm out of coffee right now. Why don't you all hang tight? I'm going to go get a cup of coffee, and I'll be right back. Yeah. The hell was I talking about? One thing that's aggravating is when I go study to learn about these things, I'll post them over on Twitter, the links that I find. But then when I go to search Twitter, they don't show up in the search results. And I think that may be a filter where it's like showing me only the top results and not verbatim. I don't know, but there were two research sources that I wanted to find for this particular episode. And the first one was about this school nurse who kept having to treat her, this was in a college, treat her students for syphilis because they kept catching it. The article says, it's a news article from like 2001 through 2006. I think it was 2006. The news article says that she had treated some of these patients 6 times for syphilis. Okay, and so, yeah, syphilis myths versus Lyme disease. The antibiotics attack the bacteria's cell wall. They tear it apart. The problem with Lyme disease is that it can survive in that state. That's when it becomes an L form or cell wall deficient bacteria. About round bodies. A lot of people mistakenly think that Lyme disease is the only bacteria that can do that, when in fact syphilis is demonstrated to be able to do that as well. Now, to be fair, there's a cultural difference here because over in Europe, and particularly Western Europe, they've had evidence of how syphilis can survive beyond antibiotic intervention in a cell wall deficient state or Lewy body form for several years now. And they even state in the research that while this is commonly known over in their region, over here in the States, it's not really known at all. And I have to say, that's definitely true. It seems like one of the reasons why I started this episode today was because I had a comment last night, and I was just pointing out that Morgellons may be associated with syphilis in some patients. I wasn't trying to tell the person that they had syphilis, but unfortunately they took it that way, and I apologized. I wasn't trying to come across that way. That wasn't my intent. And I hate that that individual was offended. And so that's why I want to get on here and make this. I'm going to have to make another podcast real soon, but that happens on that microphone and not this one. Which, to be honest with you guys, I can't even hear anything on here. This is just for, show. I'm just trying to, so you don't have to look at my nappy ass head. But I can't even hear anything coming out of these. All right, anyway, so getting back to the syphilis. That was one of the research papers that I couldn't find. It was actually a news article, but one of the other ones that I was looking for that I couldn't find was actually a research article about a Bolivian, I think it was a Bolivian or Bosnian, I'm not sure. I'm going to have to keep looking for that one. Hospital where they found that they were sending 1 out of 5 people out of the hospital. 1 out of 5. It was 5 out of 20. That's what I got to look for. 5 out of 20, and I'll find that article. Glad I remembered that. 5 out of 20 people who had this RPR test in the hospital had a false negative. So they were, because they went back and they did confirmation testing, and they found that, oh no, these people have syphilis. And so what it demonstrates is that the RPR test can give a false negative in some cases, and also probably depending on how the test is prepared. In that particular hospital, it probably had a higher false negative rate than in some other hospitals. The test isn't totally worthless, but it's insensitive enough that in some scenarios, it can produce a false negative in 1 out of 5 cases. So I'm going to find that and include a link in the description below so y'all can read about it. So the Lyme disease test can give a false negative for the same reason that a syphilis test will give a false negative. Both bacteria can evade the immune response in a variety of ways. And that's how it can also evade treatment. It can evade treatment inside these biofilm colonies, but also the bacteria itself can exist in a cell wall deficient form. And that's why it's exciting that there's a new potential antibiotic therapy on the horizon that can completely eradicate these spirochetal infections. All right, but before I wrap it up with that, another thing that syphilis has been demonstrated to accomplish is, God dang it, I had it right there and then I lost it. See, this is why I got to take my supplements before I start recording these episodes, and not after. The plasmids. Shit, I'm not supposed to breathe the coffee. People claim that Lyme disease is the only spirochetal infection with plasmids, and that syphilis doesn't have plasmids. Typically, syphilis does not have plasmids, but there are various strains of syphilis, and one of those strains has been demonstrated to have the plasmids. But regardless, it can still evade the immune response, create biofilms, and all the other tricks that Lyme disease is attributed to being able to accomplish as well. And so another thing is that there was a study that said syphilis will cause a false positive on a Lyme disease test. But the opposite isn't true, meaning that Lyme disease doesn't cause a false positive on a syphilis test. I also found a study that says that Treponema denticola will not cause a false positive on an RPR, the syphilis test. So that's interesting because they're both treponemes. But Lyme disease will cause a false positive, but Treponema denticola doesn't. So I think that, yes, definitely it's possible that Morgellons can be associated with syphilis in a group of patients that have not yet been studied. And I think that since Morgellons, we have evidence, is a genetic condition, because it only occurs in a certain breed of dogs and higher amounts than in other species, and the same is true in humans. It only occurs in some humans from ethnic backgrounds in a higher rate than in others. That it is a genetic condition. And because of that, and because in the cow model, it's treponemes, Treponema phagogenus is the treponeme that's attributed to being associated with bovine digital dermatitis, that it is possible, if not likely, that treponemes could be the primary etiologic factor associated with Morgellons patients in a group of patients that have not yet been studied. And so that's why I say, let's round up 1,000 syphilis patients and see if they don't have 6% or higher with Morgellons in that population of patients. Let's find out. Is it just spirochetes in general? And I mean, Lyme disease. If Lyme disease and syphilis have the same bag of tricks for persisting beyond antibiotic intervention, then why isn't it possible? And here's another thing. Syphilis also affects all these autoimmune genes in the body. So just like Lyme disease does, when it gets in the body, oftentimes it results in a lot of autoimmune conditions like multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, arthritis, and others. Syphilis does the same thing. It affects those same genes. And so I don't understand why in the middle of a syphilis resurgence, because every other day in the news you see an article, Texas, syphilis rate, congenital syphilis up 250% from previous year. It doesn't make sense how you can have this huge outbreak of syphilis across the country, but nobody has it. And one of the things is that nobody wants to admit they have it. Nobody wants to be associated with the sexually transmitted disease. But Lyme disease is sexually transmissible. Maybe not the debilitation, and maybe not the specific conditions that result from the infection, but the evidence shows that the infection itself can persist in vaginal secretions. It can persist in seminal secretions. And that partners, domestic partners, can share the same strain of that infection. And so even if the debilitation isn't being transferred, the infection itself can be transferred. And so, yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be looked at. I hope I cleared that up, that's why I believe that syphilis needs to be looked at, and why I tell everybody that, yeah, it's definitely something that should be concerning. There's a huge outbreak. We know that it can persist beyond antibiotics, particularly in the late stages. When I talk about neurosyphilis, that's some serious stuff. You're talking about insanity and blindness. And I'm scared to death of that. But definitely looking forward to that new potential antibiotic. I hope that cleared it up. If you guys have any comments or questions, please feel free to let me know. I apologize to that individual from last night. I was not trying to say you have syphilis, if you have Morgellons. What I was trying to say is what I just said in this video. So I hope you understand. All right. I hope you guys have a great day, and we will talk to you soon.